Every story is a ticket to somewhere extraordinary. No need to pack a bag, just settle in and let the words transport you. Now boarding, an insight to an author's mind. This is the Story Station.
You've heard of King Midas, the man who turns everything into gold, but I bet there's one thing that you didn't know about him. He was a real person. And today we have Colleen M. Storer with us to talk about her newest book, The Curse of King Midas. Thank you for coming in today, Colleen.
Hey, Emma. Great to be here.
Tell us more about your book and about yourself.
Well, first of all, thank you for featuring local authors. That's super cool. We love having the support from the local community. So thank you for that. And yeah, my latest release is called The Curse of King Midas. And I'm always excited to tell people about it because most people know the myth of the king and the fact that he wished that everything he touched would turn to gold, and the god gave him that wish. And then it turned out not to be as great as he thought it was going to be. But what I found out was that he is a real person. He was a real ruler in the 700s BC. And finding that out just opened up a huge avenue of storytelling options for me. And I have a story for why I decided to write this book in the first place. But this book is a combination, then, of the myth of King Midas and his touch of gold and the history, the actual real person. I combined the two to create this story. So there is the magic and the gods and the touch of gold and all those fun things. But there's also the real history, the real time, the real setting, and even the real bad guy that he fought at that time.
And so merging those together, that sounds like quite the challenge.
It was, but it also made it fun. The fact that there was a history there to follow, and then there was the myth. It just, I don't know, when you're a writer and you're thinking creatively about how to put a story together, and this was different than I had ever done a story before. I am what they call a pantser, which means that I don't outline my books. I found when I outlined them that I got quickly bored and no longer wanted to tell them because I already knew it was going to happen. I am a pantser, which means you're flying by the seat of your pants when you write, and I don't know what's going to happen. But in this case, there was a few guidelines because there was the history. I dove into the research like crazy and found out that the University of Pennsylvania is doing the archaeological dig right now. They have been doing that for the last 50 years, but they keep finding new things. You know, they go back and they do a little more digging, and they have found this about 2.5 mile spread that was his capital city. And so the whole story behind that is just fascinating. So I dove into all that. I found pictures online of the city. You can see the big tall stone gates where, you know, the people came into the city because there was a wall around it. That's still standing. So as they do the dig and the preservation, it's just fascinating. There's a lot of information there I'd be happy to go into. But combining that with the myth, it just made, for some reason, the story kind of exploded for me. It just kind of came to me, and I was able to write it fairly easily.
How do you reconcile when there are different accounts of history or mythology, like different variations?
I didn't find a lot of difference in his history, I think mainly because there are few records remaining. His kingdom was the kingdom of Phrygia, and all the records were lost. Because, you know, spoiler alert, I kind of hate to say this because it figures in my series eventually, but the city was burned at one point. All of their records were lost. So what we know of King Midas, we know mostly from Assyrian records. And the kingdom of Assyria was a neighboring kingdom and the kingdom that Midas warred with for quite some time. So the records what we know about him come mainly from that. And then the Greeks had some records, but then, of course, the Greeks were the one that made up this story of him and his touch of gold. So we can't really go there for realistic tellings of him, although they have some of that time. So there was so few records between the two that you don't have a lot of conflict, although I did find some later in research that has just been recently revealed that I kind of chose to ignore because it kind of messed up the story. There's some interest now in perhaps another king that may have lived south of where King Midas ruled. So that came in kind of later, but for the most part, I didn't have a lot of trouble, you know, trying to discern between this telling and that telling because we had some pretty straightforward records from Assyria that I followed.
So you said that you had an interesting story on how you decided to write this book.
Yeah, that was kind of super cool. So I'm a musician. I play the French horn, and I play in the local symphony here and then in several pit orchestras. And I have a very talented friend who plays trumpet and also is a very talented composer. He writes music frequently. And he was someone who was very, had a lot of knowledge about musicals, regularly conducts musicals, and had researched them and had even, considered writing some himself. And he came to me at one point. He had read one of my previous books, Lorena's Gift, and enjoyed it. And he said, I'm thinking of doing a musical about the story of King Midas. What would you think of writing the book about it? And from his research, he had learned that some of the most successful musicals were based on books. There was a book initially. If you think of Phantom of the Opera, there was a novel about that before there was a musical. And the same thing with King and I. And several of them had a novel first and were based on a book. And in his research, he had found that those that started with a book seemed to be better stories, better musicals than those that had not. So he just wondered if I might be interested in writing the story of King Midas. And when I first heard the request, I was honored that he would ask me. But then I was kind of like, well, I don't know, because I wasn't really a fan of King Midas. He's not a very likable character in the myth. The main thing that's emphasized about him is how greedy he is. He already was very wealthy, and he wanted more wealth in the myth. So this is not really a lovable main character. And when you're a writer, you want that for your main character. You have to have somebody that the reader is going to be able to root for. And so I was thinking, well, this could be challenging. So that's why I started researching him in the first place. Was, okay, so is there a way that I could get into this story and make it so that the reader would enjoy it and that I would enjoy it? Because if the writer isn't enjoying the writing, the reader certainly isn't going to enjoy the reading. So I knew that from experience that I had to be able to get a hold of this character. So that's the reason I started researching in the first place, and then landed on this fact that he was a real ruler. And I was just thrilled, because that just opened up all of these other avenues. And so in my story, the main character isn't motivated by greed. He does end up getting the touch of gold. He does ask for that gift, but his motivation is not just because he's greedy. His motivation is revenge.
Oh.
Yeah. And that appealed to me much more. In my story, he wants revenge against the bad guy of that time, which Midas really did fight, and that was King Sargon II. And he ruled at the same time. He was the king of Assyria, and a very successful king. He was especially successful in his ability to put together forces and have really successful battles. He was always winning territory for his kingdom. So the two of them clashed, because if you look at the history, the kingdom of Phrygia was not far from the kingdom of Assyria. And both of these kingdoms at that time were in the country of Turkey, modern-day Turkey. So the old map that I have at the beginning of the book, you can see where Phrygia was and where Assyria was, and then there was some, disputed land in between. And so there, Midas was often marshaling forces in those areas to kind of go against King Sargon II and hoping to kind of win the area for himself. So in my book, there is an old wound that Midas suffers as a young boy, and that is in the prologue of the story. And that sets the stage for his desire for revenge, and that wound was caused by King Sargon II.
I love a good revenge story.
Right? It just gives you something you can get your teeth into.
It really does.
A lot better. And you have to have a good bad guy, right? I mean, and King Sargon II made a wonderful antagonist.
Without spoiling anything, is there anything that you came across in your research that really surprised you?
Let me think. Well, I mean, just the fact that he was real at all was the biggest surprise. And the fact that, I was looking for an antagonist for this story. I was looking for a bad guy. Every story has to have an antagonist. And when I found out that he actually was fighting this other very powerful king at the time, that was like perfect. That was gold for a storyteller. And the fact, I think, that at the time, he was a very popular and wealthy king. But it wasn't just that he was wealthy, his city was. His capital city was Gordium. That's the city that they call it Gordian now. That's the city that they're excavating at this time. That city, you kind of can think of it being like a Las Vegas or something. People were traveling from Syria, which was to the east, and they were going across what is now modern-day Turkey and heading over to the coast, and then the Greek islands beyond that. His city was positioned right in the middle of that. So he was catching all the trade and all the travelers, and he just had a very great setup there. He was sitting right by what was called then the Sangarius River. Now it's called I can't remember this. It still starts with S. It's kind of Sakura, something like that. I have to look back and check. But that river is still there, although there's been a little shift in how it relates to where the city was. But he had the river right there coming from the north. And so if you're looking for, location, if you're in real estate, he had the perfect location right there to create a very wealthy capital city and thereby a very wealthy kingdom. And so he did very well, and his people did very well, and they thrived. So that part of what the Greeks eventually wrote about him was true, that he did seem to do well. What was interesting, right now they have found a tomb there, the biggest tomb that is, they call him tumulus. And what you see when you look at the pictures of the excavation they're doing right now are these huge triangular shaped, they look like hills. If you were there and just standing there, you would just think that was a hill off in the distance, but it was actually a tomb. And what they would do is they would build the tomb underground, and then they would put all this dirt on the top of it. It almost looks like a pyramid, only in dirt form. And the tomb was underneath that. And they found this, there's a ton of tombs around that area, but they found this huge one. It's like one of the top 3 biggest ones in that whole area. And they thought it was King Midas's. But when they did the research, you know how they can do time dating, they can check and see how old certain things are in the tomb. When they did that, they found out that it was too old to have been Midas. They found remains there. They thought that was him, but then they now have decided that was probably his father, the ruler before him, King Gordius, which is what Gordium was named after. And so to this date, they have not found the body of King Midas. It is like a mystery what happened to the body of King Midas. And when you asked about, are there differing versions as far as what happened to him, there are differing versions of that. And so book 2 in my series, The Midas Legacy, I get to have a little bit of artistic license with what I decide is going to happen to Midas because nobody knows for sure. There are different stories about what they think might have happened to him, but that remains a question. So we thought this was his tomb, and you can go there today to that area and see his father's tomb. And it's this elaborate thing underground made of this beautiful cedar wood. I mean, it's phenomenal what they were able to do. This is 700 BC. And they built this elaborate tomb underground. It's still there. It's still preserved. The clay pots and the remains of King Gordius and the coffin he was in and all the things that he had there with him. They even found traces of food that people ate when they had the big feast that they had when they put a king to rest. They found the traces of food that the people ate at that time. And at one point, the University of Pennsylvania, they got together with some scientists. They traced what kind of food they had at their feast. And then they had a big fundraising effort where they actually served the food that the people back then had, or as close as they could to what we have now. And I remember the main dish was like lamb. And then there was some sort of a kind of a Greek salad that went with it. And some of that, I can't remember all the things they had for the feast, but fascinating that they can actually discover what these people ate when they put King Gordius to rest in this great feast from his tomb. So that is still there, and people can go see that tomb. But poor King Midas, we don't know what happened to him.
Was it difficult to create these characters and these worlds that are so ancient that it's even hard to imagine living that long ago? How do you make these settings and characters apply to a modern audience?
I think the humanity in a character makes it relatable right away. When you look at what these people went through, and they had struggles, and they had relationships, and there were power structures that were difficult for them at that time. when you look at how they're interacting with each other, you can't help but start to relate to them because they were human. They had the same human stories that we have now. And that's where you find that connection, I think, that's fascinating with history. As you know, these people had similar struggles to what we do right now. I mean, we have people that were struggling to even survive at that time, but then we had the royal family who, of course, had access to more food and more comforts of that time. And you have power structures between the kingdom of Assyria and the kingdom of Phrygia. So when you get into these people's personal interactions, I think that part of it is pretty easy. As far as the setting goes, what did they do at that time? How did they bathe? How did they wash? How did they eat? What did they eat? All those details are more difficult. And I took a lot of time finding every bit of research I could about what kind of food they ate then. What kind of structure would their castle have been? How would they have washed their clothes? All these sorts of things that you dive into as deeply as you can. It's one of the things I was concerned about is that somehow something would seep in there that didn't feel like the time. But fortunately, the feedback I've gotten from readers is that they feel very much like they're in that time and in that world. And I was really happy about that because it was important to me to make sure that was there. But that is all based on just a lot of research, just a lot of pulling up documents and scientific studies and scholars who have, looked at that whole time and finding what they ate then and how they lived and all those things and then incorporating that in. So the setting and all of that relied heavily on research, but the characters themselves, they're people. So I have King Midas, I have his two children, his daughter Zoe, his son Onkeros, and then his relationship with his previous family, which you see in the very prologue of the book, his mother and his sister and his enemy, King Sargon II. And Sargon has relationships too. And then even the goddesses that figure into the story. There's two main goddesses that are in the story, and they are interacting with these people, and they have their own emotions and desires and disappointments that you're dealing with in the story. So I think when you get that humanity in there, that's what makes it relatable in any story, really.
Do you research at the same time as you write or before?
Most of it was before. And then as you write, you come up with, oh, shoot, how are they going to do this in this time? So you go back and look. One of the things I remember doing that was a lot of fun was how are they going to lock a door or lock somewhere where they don't want people to be? They didn't have keys at that time. They didn't have the locking mechanisms we do now. How would they lock things at this time? And I ended up finding the most fascinating video on YouTube where he demonstrated a lock they had discovered from back in 600 BC. Uh-huh. And it's this elaborate wooden lock that had all these little slots in it and these little pieces, and you had to turn it this way and that way, and then it would lock, and then you had to turn it a certain way to get it to unlock. And there's people out there that are actually making these or remaking these things that were made way back then. And so it's amazing how much information we have today, how much information we have access to. We just have to know how to dig and find it and research. And then when I found that, I was, okay, so now I can include this really realistic detail in the story that will then keep it in that time. So yeah, in your answer to your question, a bunch of it was before to find out about King Midas and his enemies in that time in history, but then a lot of it as you go and you realize, I don't know this, I've got to go discover it. So it's a little bit of both.
Sounds a bit daunting.
It was a huge project. And continues to be because it is a series. But
when it gets hard to write, what do you do?
Well, that's a whole nother question. And I've gone through that with each of my books. I have learned over time now that especially fiction writing, that the middle of the novel is always a despair point. And I've talked to many other writers about the same thing. You go along and you're setting it up, and the middle is where you go, oh man, this thing is just awful and nobody's ever going to read this, and I might as well just, forget it. And I know well enough the process now that I've been through it that happens. And the only thing you can ever do is just keep going. You just keep going. You realize that the awesome thing about writing is that you can go back and fix things. You can go back and realize where the problems are, and you can rewrite and you can fix. And that's one of the things I love about writing. I'm also a musician, as I mentioned. And when you play a solo, you get that one chance and that's it. And there's so many times we as musicians, that solo didn't come out just the way that we wanted it to. And we wish we could go back and redo it. As a writer, you can. You can go back and fix those sections. So the answer is always just to keep plugging through. And most writers will tell you that their first drafts are just a mess. And mine certainly are. My first drafts are always just a mess. But it's me telling myself the story that I want to tell. That first draft is, to me, it's kind of like watching a movie as I'm writing. And I feel like I'm channeling the story. And so the first draft is always, it's certainly nothing I would want anyone to see. And then knowing what I know now about story structure and how story works, I mean, that's one thing that I've learned over the years as a writer is you really have to understand the craft of storytelling, how a story works, what is going to make a story turn where it should, and how you're going to keep the pacing up and how you're going to make it to where a reader is going to enjoy it. So as you learn more about story structure, then you learn where a story is slowing down or maybe what's not working right for you or whatever. So as you go back and work on those subsequent drafts, that'll come through. But, once you have that first draft, and that is usually the hardest one, but once you have that, you've got something to work on, then, you're good. You can work on it.
Wow. As a writer, that's actually really that's so good to hear, because I was working on a book and I got about halfway through, and exactly like you said, I was like, I'm just can't do this anymore.
That always happens in the middle. And the thing you want to do is push through and finish. And you may have story structure problems. I mean, studying story structure is the key to learning how to tell a good story, because I used to do that. When I was first writing, I had many unfinished manuscripts because I always thought when I got to the halfway point and hit that place where I was having trouble, that it was because my idea wasn't good enough, or it was because something was wrong with the story. And so the answer was to write another story. I'd get a better idea, try a different story, and then I would be fine. And I later learned that no, that wasn't the problem. The problem was I didn't know how to tell a story yet. You have to get to where you know how to tell a story. And I know now if I handed over any of those unfinished manuscripts, either myself at this point or to another skilled writer, they would be able to finish it because they know how story works. So the only way you can learn that is to finish the darn thing and then go back and say, okay, where is this falling apart? Where is my structure not working? And so that's what I ended up doing as a younger writer, was then, tearing it apart and figuring out where the plot holes were and all that sort of thing. But yeah, it's very common to feel that in the middle. And even once you know how to tell a story, it's still very common to be in the middle of it and feel like, oh, shoot, this isn't working like I wanted it to. So yeah, that's a common thing to have happen.
Oh, well, that's a relief to hear. Is there any other things that you would like to talk about before we get to your reading?
Yeah, let me just tell a little bit more about this series. So the first book now, I didn't think it was going to be a series initially. I was just going to write the one book, and that was the idea. But the characters came to life, as they tend to do when you're writing. These people kind of take on a life of their own. And when I got to the end of it and I started sending out to some of my early readers, they were asking me, well, what happens to this character? What happens to that character? And the story does come to a satisfying ending. It could have ended there. But with people asking me, and I also had my own curiosities about, what's going to happen to these people down the road, that I have gone ahead and committed to a series. So book 2, which is called The Gamiri Invasion, still follows the history of that time. I'm about a week away from sending it to the editor right now. The draft is complete. It's gone through a couple of early readers and the changes are pretty much complete. I'm just doing some final polishing now before it goes to the editor. And the second book in the series is always a little bit scary because you want to meet the expectations of your readers, but I'm thrilled with the feedback I've gotten from my beta readers so far. I think that readers are going to be happy with book 2. So book 2 has a planned release for probably June of next year, I'm thinking. This one came out in June of 2024. I'm thinking June of 2025. Book 3, I have not started on yet, but there are 3 books planned so far. I have had some people ask me, well, do you think about, dipping back into that time period again? Well, will you go on with another series in this time period? Because there's something about the historical fantasy that seems to intrigue people. I don't know if you've read any historical fantasy. I had not before embarking on this book. But it was kind of like when I found out that it was even a genre. That was surprising. I didn't know historical fantasy was a genre. I'd heard historical fiction, but I didn't know historical fantasy was a genre. And it actually is, and kind of a new one from what I'm seeing. So I don't know. There may be more in the future, but for right now, there's 3 planned for this series.
Well, now that you've done all the research, might as well, right?
Exactly. I mean, the basis is there.
All right. Without further ado, Colleen M. Story, The Curse of King Midas.
Okay, so let me set this up a little bit. This is chapter 3 in the book, and this is the goddess character, Katya. She is the dark goddess of the underworld, and she is meeting with King Sargon II, who I mentioned. He is the antagonist in the story, and she is kind of messing with this world of men. The goddess Katya figures largely in the story. And she has her own motivations, which we don't know at this point. But this is chapter 3. It is in the kingdom of Assyria, which was King Sargon II's kingdom. He has been battling with King Midas, and he very much wants to defeat him. Katya seems to kind of be helping him out, and we don't know why that is. So that's where this chapter is. The goddess Katya walked alone through King Sargon II's animal sanctuary. She wore a short-sleeved gown made of an airy material with tiny crystals embedded into the neckline. Her hair hung loose about her shoulders, a black headband keeping it away from her face. The animal stirred as she passed, yellow gazes following her under the glow of the oil lamps. At the tiger pen, she stopped and watched the male rise to study her. He and his female had a large space that had been fashioned to include a cave in the back, but she pitied them nonetheless, robbed of their right to roam the lands. "One of these nights, I will open your cage," she said, "when I'm feeling adventurous." She found the king where she expected she would, at the lion pen. She observed undetected as he gazed over the wall into the largest enclosure in the animal sanctuary. The moon's glow illuminated the male lounging on a nearby rise, his shoulder braced against a block-shaped boulder. The female was nowhere in sight, which meant she had to be in the cave below. It was late. What the king had planned now, Katya couldn't guess. Sargon was his most attractive when he was deep in thought, his long oval face drawn down into his cleft chin, lips slightly pursed under the powerful nose. No other king had such a nose, like the side of a mountain, sloped and bold. It was the king's nose that made his face worthy of being sculpted into stone. She had told him so one night while looking into his brown eyes. He'd raised his finger to stroke the bridge. "I thought it was my brow," he'd said. The cage doors squeaked open. They were on the right and down the sloped path, near the farthest edge of the enclosure. The lion waited, ears perked, tail twitching. Katya couldn't see the servant from where she stood, but imagined a young man having been roused from his sleep to face one of nature's fiercest predators. She felt a moment's concern for him, followed by a mild curiosity at what Sargon had ordered him to do. Suddenly, a little lamb appeared, stumbling over its own legs as it was pushed from behind. The gate closed, the servant safe for another day. The lamb, on the other hand, stood clearly at risk, its white wool picking up the moon's light so that it was plainly visible, even in the night. "Not hungry, Tai?" Sargon asked in a smooth voice. "I must be feeding you too well." He waited, but Tai only regarded the lamb with mild curiosity. The lamb, for its part, was smart enough not to go fleeing across the enclosure, and instead picked its way carefully about its new home, nose down and then up, eyes alert. Katya watched for a little longer, and when it seemed there would be no drama worthy of her attention, walked toward the king. He noticed her presence almost immediately, as if she had dropped a veil from around her body. "I'm afraid if anyone is going to be doing the hunting, it will be Zerah," he said. "The female is the more cunning of the two," Katya agreed, "and the more efficient." They stood together at the wall, both of them leaning on their forearms. Katya inhaled his scent, a pleasant mix of musty sweat and laurel leaf oil. He wore a heavy cloak, for the night was chilly, his head bare, so his black hair moved with the breeze. A few gray strands played about his temples, though they dared not disturb his forehead, which seemed, as the rest of his face, built like a barricade against all who would challenge him. "I assume you know my son has disappeared," he said. Katya's heartbeat quickened. Surprising that he would bring that up so soon. She kept her expression neutral. "Which son, Your Majesty?" His features stiffened. He pulled away from the wall. "I'm not in the mood for games. If that's what you came for, I bid you be gone." He turned his back on her and started walking down the stone path toward the exit. Anger flared in Katya's breast. Who did he think he was, talking to the goddess of the underworld in such a way? With a flick of her hand, she could send him into spasms of pain. But he was right. She knew more than she was saying, and part of her admired him for sensing it. "Come, Your Majesty, I've only just arrived. If something has displeased you, perhaps I can help." She followed him with light footsteps. "Even a goddess can be distracted. You know how hard I've been working on your behalf. I hear your army recently experienced an unexpected victory." Sargon walked on. "The last battle against King Midas's forces. Word is that a strange fog descended, blinding them all against your attack. A serendipitous occurrence, no doubt." Sargon slowed at the far edge of the lion enclosure, his gaze on the lamb, which had remained near the entrance. "Ah," he said and clucked his tongue. "You understand what awaits you, don't you? It's only a matter of time." "As it is for you, Your Majesty," Katya came up behind him once more. "Soon your lands will spread all the way to the western seas, your kingdom so vast and boundless, few will find where it ends." He waited, his jaw working back and forth. He was deciding whether to go along with her feigned ignorance. "It is Emir," he said finally. Katya smiled to herself. "And this concerns you?" "He is my son." "You have many sons. Emir Alkhan is hardly one who matters. He's not an heir, and you've had him tucked away in your army for years. He could have been killed any time. Why would it disturb you now if he were gone?" "No one leaves my kingdom," Sargon turned an angry glare on her. "Not one of my soldiers, and particularly not my son." Katya averted her gaze to see Tai watching them, his golden eyes piercing, even at a distance. "I want to know how he slipped away," King Sargon said. "He's lived here his whole life," Katya said sweetly. "He probably figured a way out. With a little help from an interested party," she thought. "He must be found." The king turned back to the lions. "Have you seen him?" It was time for her best performance. "Me?" She laughed her most tinkling laugh. "Why would I have seen that mutt of a boy? I was far from here, toiling for your benefit. Now I'm beginning to feel a bit unappreciated. Do you honestly think I have nothing to do but babysit your progeny?" Sargon didn't believe her, it was plain, but he had no evidence with which to contradict her. He would have to swallow his suspicions for the time being. She watched with amusement as he worked at it, the veins taut in his neck. "You came with news," he said finally. "I'm not sure I want to share it now that I've received such an impolite reception." He cast her a wry, sideways glance, then heaved a mighty sigh, his broad chest rising and falling. Finally, he turned toward her with a chivalrous bow. "Great Katya, my apologies. I have been rude." When he stood, the anger was gone from his face, replaced by his charming smile. He took her hand in his. "Perhaps you might retire with me to my chamber. We could have some fresh fruit and wine and discuss what it is you came to discuss." How quickly he changed his demeanor. Here now was the engaging man she enjoyed, with the deep-set eyes and tender lips. With one sweep of his arm, he could make her body wilt. It wasn't hard at all to smile back, to forgive him his single-mindedness, to take his hand and walk with him alongside the lion's enclosure toward the castle, where she would share his bed once more and what bits of her plan she wanted him to know. She would enjoy the evening. Sargon was a powerful and often considerate lover, particularly when he was getting something in return. She felt her heart racing. "I think you will be pleased," she said. "It won't be long before Gordium will be yours." He acknowledged her with a hum in his throat, but his gaze was directed at the space in front of him. She checked his expression and found he was holding himself in more than usual, his jaw set even as he appeared at ease. He was truly bothered by Emir's escape, more than she had imagined he would be. "Will we attack again soon?" he asked. "Soon," she said, "I will bid you ride west for your ultimate victory." "I see," he said. "I am foreseeing riches beyond your wildest dreams, and they will be laid out before you for easy picking." She stood up on her toes and kissed him. He was hesitant at first, but then his lips warmed and he kissed her back the way he always did. She was lost for a moment, and then his grip on her arm tightened. She opened her eyes to find him looking at her with an intense gaze. "My beautiful goddess," he murmured, "you wouldn't betray me, would you?" Katya felt a flash of anger. Betray him! It was men who did the betraying, men who neglected their promises and took her gifts for granted. She cocked her head by reflex while she imagined the punishments she would visit upon him. But then he leaned down and kissed her again. She resisted at first, but her body relented even as her mind sought to come up with a suitable punishment. Suddenly, the lamb bleated. Katya paused, her lips still against Sargon's, as the bleating became more urgent, and then more sporadic, and finally dropped off with one last pitiful utterance before the night returned to its quiet rest. "You were right." Sargon lifted his head to examine the kill. "The female is more efficient." He listened to the sounds of fangs ripping flesh, his grip loosening on her arm. As the lioness ate her fill, Sargon released Katya, turning back to draw one finger softly down the side of her face. "Come, tell me more about this ultimate victory." He looped her arm in his and started walking. Katya walked alongside him, smiling to herself. Yes, the female was more efficient, for she knew how to wait for just the right moment to get what she wanted.
Wow, I loved how the scenery mirrored what was going on with the characters and the relationship. That was incredible.
Thank you. That's cool. I hadn't thought about that part, but thank you.
Really good. And just the characters, too, were very, even from the perspective of a goddess, she just had these human emotions, and that was really, really cool.
She plays a big part in the story. And she continues on through. She turned out to be a really powerful character. You never know when you start a story.
Yeah.
But she did. She meddles a lot.
Wow. Thank you so much for coming in and sharing this with us.
Thank you, Emma. It's been a pleasure. And thanks again for supporting local authors. We really appreciate it. It's not an easy industry out there, so we appreciate the support.
If you'd like to know more about Colleen M. Story and her books, you can find her at colleenmstory.com.
Thank you for traveling with us. Next stop, your work of art. Poetry, fiction, creative non-fiction, you name it. Email us at storystation@riverbendmediagroup.com. Submission guidelines are not shy. They can be found in the podcast description. The Story Station, hosted by Emma, is a production of Riverbend Media Group.